There's a story we all tell ourselves, isn't there? A deep-down, gut-level kind of truth that gets hammered into us from the time we're kids. You want something, you work for it. You work hard, harder than the next guy, and eventually the world just has to give way. It's simple arithmetic, or so we think. You put in the hours, you break your back, you earn your keep, and one day, all that sweat, all that muscle, it'll add up to something more than just getting by. It'll add up to enough. For a long time, most of us just nod, clench our jaw, and keep pushing. We believe in the sheer, unadulterated power of effort, the kind that leaves you bone-tired but proud, smelling of honest work and a day well spent. We see it as our birthright, our strength, the only true compass in a world that often feels like it's spinning just to throw you off. But sometimes that belief, that unwavering faith in the grind, it becomes a cage. A set of invisible bars built brick by painstaking brick, until you realize you're just running in place, worn out and wondering if you missed a memo somewhere, wondering if the arithmetic was wrong all along. There was a man, a good man, named Eugene. He was 48 years old, though the lines etched around his eyes and the slight permanent stoop in his shoulders suggested he'd lived a few more decades in dog years. Eugene was a construction worker, through and through, the kind of man you'd trust with the very foundations of your home, knowing he'd build it true and strong because that's just how he was made. He wasn't loud, never one for big speeches or bragging. He just was. He was the bedrock, the quiet force you could always count on. You'd know him by his hands first. Oh, those hands. They told a story all their own, a raw, honest autobiography of a life spent earning every penny with honest labor. They were broad and thick, calloused like old leather, fingers permanently bent in a slight curve from gripping tools and hoisting beams. The knuckles were gnarled, scarred with faint white lines where wood splintered or metal scraped, and under the fingernails a perpetual shadow of dirt and grime, no matter how many times he scrubbed them clean at the end of a shift. They were strong, those hands, capable of tenderness when holding his daughter's hair or tightening a bolt with precise, unyielding force. But mostly they were tools, instruments of his will, extensions of a work ethic that ran deeper than any concrete slab he ever poured. His face was a roadmap of the same journey. Weathered skin, tanned and lined from years under the sun, a permanent squint from dust and bright light. His jaw was often set, not in anger, but in a quiet determination, a perpetual state of problem-solving. But it was his eyes that truly held the weight of his experience. Deep-set and a muted hazel, they were tired, yes, often profoundly so, but they were also observant, missing nothing. They carried the unspoken burdens of a man who watched, analyzed, and carried the load for others, always sizing up the next challenge, always looking for the weak point, the right angle. There was a flicker of something ancient in them, a quiet resilience, like an old oak tree that had weathered 1,000 storms and still stood firm, maybe a little gnarled, but unbroken. He carried himself with the solid, grounded presence of someone who knew the earth beneath his feet, a man whose whole life had been about making things stable, making them last. He looked like a man who hadn't asked for much, except maybe a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, and who had given every ounce of himself to make sure his family never wanted for anything he could provide. He wasn't the kind of man to talk himself up, to assert his value with words. He asserted it with every swing of a hammer, every perfectly cut board, every clean finish. His gruff exterior was simply the protective casing around a man who felt everything deeply, and whose unwavering dependability was his truest language. This man was Eugene. 48 years old, every one of those years etched into the map of his hands and the lines around his eyes. He ran a small outfit, Eugene's Construction, just him and a couple of hired hands most days, tackling remodels, small additions, the kind of work the big boys didn't bother with, but that kept a roof over plenty of heads in the sprawling suburbs. He was the foreman, the estimator, the laborer, the problem solver, often all at once, his days a ceaseless ballet of sweat and calculation. His mornings began before the first hint of sunrise smeared across the eastern sky. The alarm clock, a digital relic from a forgotten Christmas, would blare at 4:45 a.m., a metallic shriek that cut through the deep sleep of exhaustion. Eugene never hit snooze. There was no time for it, no room for indulgence in a life measured by deadlines and dollar signs. His feet hit the cold linoleum floor with a practiced thud, the house still silent, a fleeting peace before the morning chaos of school bags and breakfast demands began to stir. He'd head straight for the coffee maker, its gurgle a familiar comfort, a promise of warmth in the pre-dawn chill. While the dark brew dripped, he'd sit at the kitchen table, the dim glow of the counter light illuminating a stack of invoices, a bid proposal scribbled on a legal pad, or a handful of overdue bills. Mortgage, car payment, Emily's rapidly approaching college tuition, a mountain looming on the horizon. David's braces, a constant low thrum of expense. The numbers swam before his eyes, a relentless tide of obligations that no amount of sweat seemed to truly push back. He'd run the calculations in his head again and again, trying to find a margin, a sliver of profit that always seemed to shrink under the weight of unforeseen material costs or an unexpected delay, leaving him with little more than enough. By 5:30 a.m., he was in his beat-up Ford F-250, the engine rumbling to life with a familiar cough. The roads were quiet then, just a few other early birds, ghosts in the pre-dawn gloom heading to their own battlegrounds. He'd drive his way through the still-sleeping streets, past the dim glow of convenience stores and the occasional early riser walking a dog. The route was etched into his muscle memory, every pothole and familiar landmark a silent companion. He'd arrive at the site, the first truck usually, pulling up to the chain-link fence, the padlock cold and heavy in his gloved hand. The air would be sharp with the scent of damp earth and yesterday's concrete, a smell that had long ago become the perfume of his life. The next 10 hours were a blur of motion and raw effort. He'd be laying foundation, the rhythmic thump of a hammer against wood, the whine of a saw cutting through planks. He'd be wrestling rebar into place, each rod a cold, unyielding serpent that demanded respect and strength. Be pouring concrete, guiding the thick gray liquid with a practiced hand, feeling the vibration through his boots as the mixer churned. His muscles would scream, a dull ache that grew into a persistent throb by midday, then into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion by quitting time. Lunch was a quick sandwich, eaten perched on a stack of lumber or a cooler, eyes scanning blueprints, mind already on the next task, the next problem to solve. There was no time for small talk, no energy for idle chatter. Just the work, always the work. He was the first to arrive, the last to leave. Not because anyone asked him to, but because that's what a man did. That's what he did. He believed in the honest day's wage for an honest day's labor, and then some. The extra hour, the extra push, that was his signature, his silent promise to himself and to his family that he was doing everything he could. But the problem was, everything he could was always just enough to keep the wolves from the door, never enough to build a real fence. Every month was a race. He'd pay the mortgage, watch the balance tick down on the credit card that always seemed to creep up again, put money aside for Emily's future and David's immediate needs. But the margins were razor-thin. A bad batch of lumber, a surprise increase in fuel costs, a subcontractor who dragged their feet, any of it could send the whole delicate house of cards wobbling. He saw other contractors, younger guys sometimes, driving newer trucks, building bigger projects. He'd nod a silent greeting, a respectful acknowledgement of their hustle, but a quiet knot would form in his gut. He worked harder than any of them, he knew it. So why was he still always just scraping by? Deep down, beneath the calloused hands and the tired eyes, Eugene was a man haunted by the ghost of what could have been. He started out, almost 30 years ago, with a fire in his belly, a dream of building more than just houses. He wanted to build an empire, a legacy. Not a sprawling corporate monstrosity, but a solid, dependable company that carried his name. One that Emily and David could look at with pride, maybe even join one day if they chose. He envisioned steady growth, a crew of loyal men, projects that stretched beyond the small residential jobs he mostly took on now. He saw himself, older, wiser, directing from the helm, his mind shaping the landscape rather than his back breaking beneath it. But somewhere along the line, the fire had dwindled to embers, buried under the ash of endless toil. The dreams became whispers he only heard in the quiet moments between sleep and the unforgiving dawn. He'd look at his hands, thick and strong, capable of shaping concrete and raising walls, and wonder why they hadn't shaped his own destiny into something more substantial. The fear wasn't just about paying the bills. It was about the erosion of that initial hope, the slow, insidious decay of a grander vision. It was the fear that he was stuck, perpetually treading water, fighting a current that was too strong to ever truly swim against. He knew he was good at what he did. Hell, he was great at it, meticulous and unflinching, but his greatest strength, his unwavering work ethic, had become his cage. He couldn't stop, couldn't delegate, because no one he believed would care as much or work as hard or get it right the way he did. So he just kept pushing, kept doing, kept grinding, hoping that sheer force of will would eventually break him free, even as it slowly broke him down. The legacy he yearned for felt further away with every rising sun, a mirage shimmering just out of reach in the relentless heat of his exhausting daily grind. The legacy he yearned for felt further away with every rising sun, a mirage shimmering just out of reach in the relentless heat of his exhausting daily grind. Then came the Bayview job. A big renovation, 3 separate units in an old brownstone, all needing to be turned around for a quick flip. The client was demanding, the deadline brutal, and Eugene, as always, had bitten off more than he could chew, refusing to turn away the work. He'd committed to a schedule that, looking back, was a suicide mission for one man and a small, stretched crew. For 3 days straight, the sun rose and set and rose again while Eugene stayed on site. The first double shift bled into the second, fueled by stale coffee and the gnawing anxiety of falling behind. His muscles screamed, his back a constant thrum of pain, but he pushed through, laying tile until his knees locked, hauling drywall until his shoulders felt dislocated, painting until his eyes burned from the fumes and the sheer lack of sleep. By the third night, the site was a ghost town, only the hum of an air scrubber and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet breaking the silence. His crew had packed up hours ago, exhausted but done their part. Eugene, however, still had a punch list the length of his arm. He was installing the last kitchen cabinet, his arms aching as he lifted the heavy oak box into place, securing it to the wall. Sweat stung his eyes, blurring his vision, and the drill felt impossibly heavy in his calloused hands. He finished, stepped back, a grunt of satisfaction escaping his lips, but the feeling was hollow. His head spun. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow. He leaned against the newly installed counter, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. A sharp, searing pain shot through his left arm and up into his chest. Not a muscle strain, this was different. This was a fear he'd never known, cold and clinical, gripping him tight. He slid down the cool laminate, collapsing onto the dusty floor, his breathing shallow, his world narrowing to the insistent pulse in his ears. He lay there, curled on the concrete, the faint smell of sawdust and fresh paint suddenly sickening, until the pain slowly, mercifully receded, leaving him weak, trembling, and utterly, profoundly terrified. He managed to crawl to his truck, the short drive home a blur of red tail lights and the dull throb behind his sternum. Sarah, ever the light sleeper, found him slumped in his recliner, still in his work clothes, the first streaks of dawn painting the sky outside. Her questions were gentle, laced with concern, but he waved them off, mumbled something about heartburn, and finally stumbled into bed, falling into a sleep so deep it felt like oblivion. But oblivion wasn't kind. He woke abruptly at 3 a.m., the house silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He was alone in the vast, empty quiet of his own mind. The pain was gone, but the fear lingered, a cold hand on his throat. He sat up in bed, heart still skipping a beat now, and then the memory of that crushing sensation vivid. He stared at the ceiling, not really seeing it, but seeing instead the last 3 days, the last 3 years, the last 20 years. What had it all been for? He'd delivered the job, pushed his body to the absolute breaking point, flirting with something truly catastrophic. The next morning, the client called, gushing about the finished product, praising his dedication. Eugene felt a surge of his usual pride, fleeting as it always was. But then Sarah had reminded him about the stack of invoices, the receipts for the emergency supplies, the unexpected labor for fixing the old plumbing, the hours spent troubleshooting the electrical. He sat at the kitchen table, the numbers swimming before his eyes, Sarah's quiet presence a silent accusation. He'd quoted too low. He'd accounted for contingencies, but not for the sheer scale of the unexpected. He had worked over 60 hours, nearly killed himself, and when he finally tallied it up, the profit margin on the Bayview job was less than $300. 300 measly dollars for 3 double shifts, for nearly collapsing on site, for scaring himself half to death. He pushed the papers away, the anger bubbling up from a place deep inside him, quickly turning into a suffocating shame. He'd been a fool. All that effort, all that sacrifice, all for what? To barely break even. His whole life he'd believed that if he just worked harder, pushed longer, endured more, the rewards would eventually come. He was good, damn good at what he did, a craftsman, a bulldog, a man who refused to quit. But he was a bulldog chained to a broken wagon, pulling it himself, unaware that the wheels were square. He'd sacrificed his health, his time with Sarah and the kids, all to keep this rickety cart moving forward. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who built things, fixed things. But what had he built for himself, for his family, beyond a barely tolerable existence? What good was all that muscle, all that grit if it was being misdirected, squandered on projects that barely paid for his time? The silence of the 3 a.m. house pressed in on him, heavy with the weight of unspoken regrets. He was tired, bone-deep tired, not just in his body, but in his very soul. The silence of the 3 a.m. house pressed in on him, heavy with the weight of unspoken regrets. He was tired, bone-deep tired, not just in his body, but in his very soul. He leaned back in his worn kitchen chair, the wood creaking a familiar protest. For a long time he just sat there, staring at the dimly lit wall, past the stacks of unpaid bills, past the framed photos of Emily and David, past the reflection of his own weary face in the darkened window. He saw a man who had given everything, bled himself dry, only to find himself perpetually treading water. A slow, heavy sigh escaped him, a sound laden with the futility of years. The health scare, the near collapse on the job, it had cracked something open inside him that his sheer stubbornness had kept sealed. He wasn't mad anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a vast, empty space where hope used to reside. He looked again at the $300, the paltry reward for a week of killing himself. It was a joke, a cruel punchline to a lifetime of effort. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst of inspiration, no flash of genius or bolt from the blue. It was a quiet, internal settling. A recognition so profound, it stole the air from his lungs. He had been so focused on doing, on pushing, on enduring that he'd never stopped to ask if he was pushing in the right direction, or even if he needed to be pushing at all. He had been operating on pure muscle memory, driven by a fear of standing still, of not providing. He closed his eyes, the pressure behind them a familiar ache. "Enough!" he whispered, the word barely audible, a private covenant with himself in the quiet of the night. It wasn't an angry shout or a defeated whimper. It was a statement of fact, a line drawn in the sand of his own exhaustion. He didn't know what came next. He had no grand plan, no sudden blueprint for escape. All he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone was that he absolutely would not continue like this. The old way was done. The bulldog was off the broken wagon. The next morning, the alarm blared its usual shrill summons at 4:45 a.m. For years, the sound had been his cue to spring into action, an urgent call to arms. He'd be out of bed before the last echo faded, moving through the pre-dawn quiet with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewing, lunch packed, tools checked. But this morning, Eugene didn't move. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the insistent beeping drilling into his skull, not quite piercing the fog of his deep-seated weariness. Sarah stirred beside him, a soft murmur escaping her lips. "Gene, everything all right?" He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Yeah, just thinking." He finally swung his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar stiffness protesting. The pull to follow his ingrained routine was a physical thing, a current dragging him towards the shower, towards the quick breakfast, towards the truck and the job site. His hands, even now, twitched with the urge to grip a hammer, to feel the familiar weight of a wrench. It felt profoundly wrong to hesitate. Like a betrayal of everything he stood for, every fiber of his being screamed at him to get going, to do something. But he fought it. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a coffee, but instead of taking it to the garage to review the day's tasks, he sat at the kitchen table. He pulled out the worn, spiral-bound notebook he usually used for quick measurements or material lists. It sat blank on the table between his coffee cup and a stack of utility bills. He just looked at it. The silence was different now, not heavy with regret but with an unfamiliar tension. His mind felt sluggish, resisting the new demand. What was he supposed to do? What did not doing it the old way even mean? He opened the notebook to a fresh page, something he hadn't done in years outside of a job-specific calculation. He didn't have a pen. He got up, found one in the junk drawer, the old habits still guiding his smaller actions. He sat back down. He wrote nothing. Instead, he just stared at the page, at the faint lines, trying to clear his head of the endless tasks, the immediate demands. He forced himself to remember the Bayview job, not the frantic execution, but the initial bid, the projected costs, the timeline. He looked at it like he was seeing it for the first time, as an outsider. Where had the money gone? Where had the time vanished? His chest tightened. This felt like doing nothing, felt like slacking. His entire life, his identity, had been built on being the hardest worker, the man who never stopped. To sit here doing nothing but thinking felt alien, unproductive, almost shameful. But the memory of the health scare, the exhaustion, the $300, it held him in place. It was a new kind of hard work, this stillness, a quiet rebellion against a lifetime of ingrained movement. He took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth a small anchor. He wouldn't pick up a hammer until he understood where the nails truly needed to go. He would not move until he knew the real problem, not just the one right in front of him. The next morning, back on a small renovation job in the old part of town, Eugene moved differently. Not physically, not yet, but the rhythm inside him was off-kilter. He still showed up before anyone else, the early sun barely kissing the brickwork, but instead of immediately barking orders or grabbing the heaviest saw, he stood for a moment. Just stood. His crew, arriving in dribs and drabs, eyed him. A few nodded, a few just walked past, assuming he was planning the first cut. He was planning, but it felt like a foreign language. He walked the perimeter of the half-gutted living room, notebook in hand, pen poised. He wasn't looking at the obvious, the sagging ceiling beam that needed shoring, the ancient wiring he'd have to rip out. He was trying to see past them to the next problem, and the one after that. How could the demo lead smoothly into the framing? Could two guys be doing the rough-ins while another started on the new window openings without tripping over each other? It was a simple job, one he could usually run on instinct, but he forced himself to break it down to ask questions he'd never voiced before. Why do it this way? Is there a better way? The silence of his contemplation was loud. He could feel Mike, his foreman of 15 years, a younger version of Eugene in his younger days, watching him with a raised eyebrow. Mike was already laying out sawhorses, ready to get his hands dirty. Eugene felt the familiar itch, the primal urge to step in, to show them he wasn't slacking, to grab a pry bar and just start tearing. His hands, calloused and strong, twitched. His entire body screamed for the familiar burn of physical labor. This thinking felt like stalling, weakness. "Everything all right, boss?" Mike's voice was gruff, an edge of concern and impatience. Eugene grunted, his eyes still scanning a wall. Just thinking. Thinking what? Thinking about how we're gonna do this without wasting a damn minute. It wasn't a lie, but it sounded thin, even to his own ears. He finally barked a few directions, not the usual rapid-fire volley, but slower, more deliberate, almost like he was reading from a script. He delegated the first demolition phase to Mike and a new young guy, Daniel, instructing them to focus only on specific sections, not the whole room at once. It went against every fiber of his being. His gut told him to jump in, oversee every swing, correct every mistake. But he made himself step back to watch, to let them make their own way. He spent a solid hour just observing, jotting notes, mentally calculating, resisting the urge to micromanage every swing of the sledgehammer. It felt like walking through treacle, every step requiring immense effort against a powerful current. By the end of day 3, he was exhausted, but not in the familiar, bone-deep way. This was a mental fatigue, a constant inner dialogue fighting against ingrained habits. He hadn't lifted as much, hadn't pushed as hard with his body, but his brain felt like it had run a marathon. He found himself almost grabbing a tool, then stopping, forcing himself to consider the implications, the ripple effect. The crew was efficient enough, but he saw moments where they'd wait for a piece of equipment or walk too far for a specific nail gun. Little things that added up, moments he'd usually ignore or just personally compensate for. Now they screamed at him. Day 7 brought a new kind of frustration. He wasn't seeing the massive breakthrough, the immediate payoff he secretly hoped for. The crew was still used to him being the human bulldozer, the one who stepped in when something went wrong, and they were a little lost without his constant, physical presence. He'd delegated the ordering of some new insulation, trusting Mike to handle it, only to find out it was the wrong R-value when it arrived. The old Eugene would have erupted, then cursed, then driven to the supplier himself to fix it. The new Eugene felt a hot wave of anger, but he paused. He looked at the invoice, the notes Mike had taken. It was an honest mistake, a miscommunication with the supplier. Eugene made Mike call them, made him handle the return, made him reorder the correct insulation, explaining step by step why the right R-value mattered. It took longer. It felt inefficient. It bit into the day's schedule. But he resisted the urge to take over. "You're different, Eugene," Sarah said one evening, watching him sit at the kitchen table, not poring over blueprints, but just staring at a blank page in his notebook, a pen in his hand. "You're not collapsing on the couch the second you walk in the door." He just grunted, rubbing his temples. "My head's more tired than my back these days." He was trying to figure out how to streamline the waste disposal from the site. The dumpster was filling too fast, costing too much. It felt like an endless, frustrating puzzle. He'd almost given up that morning, almost just told Mike to order another dumpster and be done with it. But then he remembered the $300, the cold dread of the hospital, and he'd forced himself to call 3 more disposal companies, asking about volume discounts, about different container sizes. It was a tedious, mind-numbing task, a task he used to dismiss as office work for someone else. But there was no one else. By day 14, the struggle was a constant companion. He'd caught himself about to jump onto the scaffolding to fix a crooked header himself, only to stop, take a deep breath, and calmly explain to Daniel where he'd gone wrong and how to correct it. It was slower, yes, but he saw a flicker of understanding in Daniel's eyes, a rare light that wouldn't have been there if Eugene had just muscled in and done it for him. Still, every cell in his body screamed for the simplicity of just doing. The temptation to revert, to just be the old Eugene, was a roaring fire, fueled by the minor setbacks, the lingering frustrations, the sheer mental effort. He sometimes felt like a man trying to swim upstream while carrying a sack of wet cement. It was exhausting. He'd even had a moment that morning where he almost just packed it in, called Sarah, told her he was selling the truck and getting a job where someone else made the damn decisions. But then he saw Emily's backpack by the door, David's cleats by the stairs. He saw Sarah's worn hands as she made his coffee, and he remembered the fear of not being enough, the fear of breaking down. He might not know exactly what he was building yet, but he knew for damn sure he couldn't go back to just shoveling coal into a boiler that was already rusting out. He couldn't quit. Not now. By day 20, something quietly began to rearrange itself in Eugene's world. The initial awkwardness of delegating hadn't entirely vanished, but the grimace on his face was less pronounced when he handed off a task. He started noticing patterns in the mistakes his crew made, patterns that pointed not to laziness, but to unclear instructions, or tools misplaced, or materials ordered incorrectly. The spreadsheets, once a source of dread, were starting to tell him a story he hadn't understood before. He saw the wastage, the unnecessary trips, the moments where a few minutes of planning up front could save hours on the back end. He found himself spending an entire morning not lifting a single beam, but sketching out a new delivery schedule, factoring in traffic patterns and supplier lead times, something he'd always considered a luxury he couldn't afford. That afternoon, when the drywall arrived precisely when and where it was needed, instead of sitting on the curb for 2 hours, or worse, arriving 3 hours late, a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval passed between him and Daniel. It wasn't a cheer, not a high five, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had worked differently. Others started to notice. Not with words, not directly to Eugene, that wasn't their way. But Daniel, who used to grumble under his breath when Eugene hovered, found himself asking questions, seeking clarification rather than just doing what he thought was right. Mike, the quietest on the crew, started suggesting ways to organize the tool shed that echoed Eugene's newfound focus on efficiency. The air on the job site felt different, less frantic, more like a well-oiled machine finding its rhythm. The frantic, almost desperate energy that had defined Eugene for so long was slowly being replaced by a calmer, more focused intensity. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was acting. Hope, a feeling he hadn't truly recognized in years, began to seep back in, not as a sudden burst, but like the slow, rising sun after a long night. It wasn't the giddy hope of a young man with big dreams, but the grounded, steady hope of a man who was finally, deliberately, building something he could stand on. He still worked hard, harder than most, but the exhaustion was different. It was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from problem-solving, not just problem-enduring. He found himself thinking about Emily's college, not with a knot in his stomach, but with a quiet sense of possibility. David's soccer practices didn't feel like another obligation to rush to, but a well-earned break from a productive day. Weeks bled into months. The small contracting business, once a testament to Eugene's sheer willpower, began to transform. He started hiring carefully, bringing in a dedicated office manager, someone who could handle the invoicing, the permits, the dreaded spreadsheets that he now understood were the backbone of growth, not just busy work. He even hired another lead foreman, taking some of the direct supervision off his own shoulders, allowing him to step back and look at the bigger picture. One afternoon, almost a year after the first subtle shift, Eugene found himself not on a dusty construction site, but in a meeting room with 3 other contractors, discussing a joint venture for a much larger project than his company could have ever tackled alone. He sat at the head of the table, his hands, still calloused and strong, resting on a polished mahogany surface. His eyes, though still carrying the weight of experience, now held a sharp, calculating glint. He wasn't just a worker at that table, he was a builder of enterprises. He was a strategist. Later that evening, as he watched Emily help David with his homework at the kitchen table, A warmth spread through him that wasn't just the comfort of home. Sarah, catching his eye, offered a soft smile. He saw the relief in her face, the lessening of a burden she'd silently carried alongside him for years. The house was still modest, the yard still tidy, but it felt different. It felt like a foundation for something sturdy, something lasting. He remembered the early days, the endless grind, the constant feeling of running in place. He thought about that old concrete mixer just spinning its wheels. He'd learned a different way to build. "I used to think working harder was the answer to everything," he told Daniel one morning, standing on the edge of a new project site, gesturing with a blueprint instead of a hammer. "Turns out working smarter, thinking ahead, that's where the real muscle is. You can lift a ton of bricks day in, day out, break your back doing it. Or you can figure out how to get a forklift or a crane. Same job, way different outcome for your back and your wallet." He paused, looking out at the expanse of the land they were about to transform. "And your peace of mind." There was a man who once believed his strength was measured only by the weight he could lift and the hours he could put in. But he learned that true power isn't in moving every brick yourself. It's in laying the right foundation.